Evening. Welcome to Talking Politics. I'm your host this evening, Mia Scanga, and tonight you're going to be meeting with one of our local Jersey City historian, Dennis Doran, and he's going to take us on a small tour of the various grave sites of very famous Jersey City, Hudson County politicians. And here we're at Holy Name Cemetery right off of West Side Avenue in Jersey City, and we're standing in front of the grave of probably the most famous politician, Frank Hague. So Dennis, thank you so much for being on our show.
I'm delighted to be here, Mia.
Wonderful. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a native of Jersey City, and I grew up in the Heights, and have always been interested in history, so I've made it a sort of an avocation amateur. I was a reporter for the Jersey Journal in the 1970s, and before that for the Hudson Dispatch from Union City, now lately gone, lamented. And after that I formed a real estate business, and I've spent a lot of time restoring old buildings in Jersey City. So that's what I do now. I have a number of buildings that are apartments, and I rent my apartments and hopefully keep my tenants happy.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm going to let Dennis tell us about our first visit here with Frank Hague and a little bit about the history of Frank Hague. And I'm sure anybody who lives in Jersey City has heard about him.
Sure. We are here at the mausoleum of the legendary Frank Hague, one of the most important political figures in the state of New Jersey and even in the nation. Frank Hague was born in 1876 on the kitchen table of a slum tenement in downtown Jersey City. He died on New Year's Day in 1956 at a luxurious apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, where he lived at the time. He also had a very lovely mansion near the seashore in Deal, New Jersey, a 14-room duplex apartment on the boulevard in Jersey City, and a house in Palm Beach, Florida. And somehow he managed to accumulate all of this, never rising beyond the position of mayor of Jersey City, which paid between $7,500 and $8,000 a year. I guess Mayor Hague would say he made wise investments. His tomb here is isolated from everyone else, as I think he would find appropriate. It seems to be a model of the famous Jersey City Medical Center. It's a kind of an Art Deco style. And we look to Hague and we study his career today, even today, as an example of what can be done with politics in this country. Hague started poor, Irish Catholic, from a slum in Jersey City. He became a constable at the age of 21 in the 1890s, later became the custodian of the City Hall, which allowed him to have his first attempt at patronage, where he could hire assistant custodians. And those people were on his payroll. And from there, he rose up, having met all of the important figures and ingratiated himself with them, to be on the city commission beginning in 1913. He was a commissioner in charge of public safety. This was a very, very significant move for a young man on the move, because Hague then took command of the police department and the fire department, but primarily the police department, which he totally reorganized. And he made it his campaign theme to use the police department to root out corruption, crime in Jersey City. This endeared him to the public. He was very popular doing this. He rode around town in a big car on the running board, had made sure his picture was in the paper, swooping down on miscreants so that the crime was wiped out. And indeed, it was wiped out. He was very, very efficient at this. He used it as his power base. He eliminated pretty much wanton street crime in Jersey City. He made the streets safe for women and children to walk on. There was no prostitution in Jersey City. There was no organized crime in Jersey City. Mobsters were not allowed. This was a linchpin of Hague's power, how he got started, and how he continued through his 30 years as mayor. He was elected mayor in 1917, and then he was continuously elected all the way through to 1946, when his 8th term as mayor began. He resigned in 1947 at the age of 72 to supposedly retire to Florida, and turned the mayoralty over to his nephew, whose name was Frank Hague Eggers. And that was a fatal move for him. Eggers was toppled 2 years later, and the Hague regime basically came to an end by the early 1950s. He died January the 1st, 1956, and was buried here a few days later. During Hague's time, he was extremely well known throughout the nation. He built a power structure that was unrivaled in New Jersey. He was the vice chairman of the National Democratic Committee for years. He had an organization that was basically, I think, unrivaled in the country. How did he do this? Hague's experience coming from a poor, low-class background where nothing was available, and he was very sickly as a child and very conscious of his health, led him to form an organization that took care of the people of the city. So that, for example, a new family moving in would find before their furniture truck was unloaded that the local political leader was there to assist them. Do you need help having the gas or electric turned on? Having your address changed with the post office? Do you need help getting a job? Do your children need a job? What do you need? We will do it, and we will take care of it. And the service was immediate. And this was the hallmark of his career. Throughout his life, he was challenged repeatedly by people who said he's corrupt and he's no good and we've got to get rid of him. And Hague would laugh at them and say they come in here and they're going to reform, but they only make a few speeches and they do it a few weeks before election and they think that they're going to be elected. He said, you have got to have an organization, and the organization has got to be there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can't come in at the last minute and expect people will sweep to the polls to throw the rascals out. They won't do that. In fact, 50% of the people have got to be coaxed to the polls or dragged to the polls. And he knew this, and he knew how to run an election campaign. Elections were like a battle, and he was the general. He sat in his office at City Hall. There were 308 election districts in Jersey City, 658 election districts in Hudson County, statewide elections in particular. Hague sat down there. Reports were given to him continuously. Charts are on the wall. The vote, hour by hour, from every precinct was reported. If there was something going wrong, it was slow, there had to be an answer why. He was overjoyed when the results would come in, and the results were always higher than they were the last time. That was Hague's victory. We will get tremendous results, overwhelming results. And it paid off for him because he was able to control, by and large, the political system in the state of New Jersey, electing governors repeatedly. The governors were there to appoint people that Hague needed to be appointed to positions such as prosecutors who didn't prosecute him, and superintendents of election who didn't question the elections too closely, tax appeal boards that would ratify Hague's tax increases on the industries, particularly the railroads. And this went on for decades. So he was extremely successful. It's been said of Hague that if he had gone into business, into industry, he would have been a chairman of General Motors, perhaps, or certainly a kingpin, because of his great ability to organize. He did have a downside, of course, and that is, I think, perhaps coming from his difficult background, he was a fighter and a scrapper and not terribly polished, perhaps, in wooing people where they could be wooed, and if you opposed him, you did so at the threat of life and limb. He was not afraid to take you on, and he would. And the battles that he undertook against people are legendary. They involve trumped up charges, people beat up, public speech stifled, no free speech in Jersey City. And so over the years, he made many enemies. And for decades, there was opposition to Haig. He crushed the opposition repeatedly, but it was always there. It probably need not have been there, but it was perhaps his demeanor or his personality that encouraged it. He did not brook any opposition. They said of Haig that he looked like a glum and ancient turtle, his face. He was very severe in his style, wore high collars, very old-fashioned because he feared that he would get a throat ailment. And so I think it made him perhaps very rigid, and the opposition, though, he beat back continually until finally, late in his career, his regime was toppled by one of his lieutenants, John V. Kenney, who is buried very close by. They were good friends for many, many years, but Kenney beat Eggers in the famous election of 1949, which made headlines across the country. The Haig regime was toppled, and that was that. In his later years, he was literally not able to enter Jersey City because there were so many people wishing to serve him with subpoenas to appear before courts of investigation. So he had to avoid Jersey City. And his last appearance here is the final appearance right behind us. I don't know if there are any subpoenas underneath the door of the mausoleum, but since many times voters who are in the cemetery continued to vote, it's not impossible that subpoenas could be served to the dead as well. The stories of the elections are almost beyond belief. At one point in 1937, it was calculated that there were 147,000 persons eligible to vote in Jersey City. That is, adults over the age of 21 qualified to vote. Yet the voting registration roll showed 160,000. Now, where did the others come from? Well, they came from places like right here, Holy Name Cemetery. Just because you're dead doesn't mean you're disenfranchised. Former Governor Brendan Byrne of New Jersey once said that when he dies, he would like to be buried in Hudson County so he can continue to be active in politics. There's a famous political cartoon in a New York newspaper showing this cemetery with Frank Haig standing at the gate, dressed as the angel Gabriel in a white tunic with wings and a halo above his head, and he's blowing a trumpet. And behind him, the grave doors are opening, and all the corpses are coming out in shrouds holding ballots, going to vote. And underneath it, it says, Jersey City Resurrection Day. So I can testify personally to my knowledge that some of that still continues, because I know of tenants of mine who have left years ago and are still on the voting records here in Jersey City. Among the more prominent gravestones here in Holy Name Cemetery is the one marked Haig. It is the grave site of other members of Frank Haig's family. He had a large family. And among those who are laid to rest at this site is the remains of his nephew, Frank Haig Eggers. Eggers was the son of Frank Haig's sister Alice. In 1942, Eggers, who was a lawyer, was serving in the Coast Guard during the Second World War, and his uncle had him appointed in absentia to the Jersey City Commission. In 1945, he ran for commissioner on his own and was elected along with his uncle, who was then elected to his 8th term as mayor. And 2 years after that, in 1947, Frank Haig decided to retire from the mayoralty, and he passed the gavel to his anointed successor, Frank Eggers. Eggers served out the remainder of Mayor Haig's term, ending in 1949. And then he ran for the mayoralty on his own, but was defeated in the great and famous 1949 election, where the freedom ticket of John V. Kenney swept to victory and ended the domination of the Haig machine after 3 decades. Now, just down the road from Frank Eggers, we find the tomb, the gravesite of John V. Kenney. Kenny was one of the 12 apostles, there being 12 wards in Jersey City, and he was the leader of the downtown Second Ward, where Frank Hague and he had come from, and he was a great disciple of Hague. He thought that he should assume the mayoralty when Frank Hague retired, but Hague instead brought Eggers on and made Eggers the mayor. This offended Kenny to such an extent that he went and complained to Hague, and Hague not only dismissed his complaints, but drummed him out of the Democratic Party, out of the organization. And that was too much for Kenny, so he mounted what became a very successful campaign to oust Hague and Eggers and the whole Hague machine. And the Freedom Ticket of 1949 used as its theme song, "Now is the Hour," a tune recorded by Bing Crosby in the 1940s. Now is the hour when we must say goodbye. Soon you'll be sailing across the sea. And of course it was a adieu to Frank Hague, and it worked. When the election results were in May of 1949, there were wild jubilation in the streets, torchlight parades. They carried a coffin around with a sign on the top that said, "Here lies the remains of the Hague organization, aged 30 years. They carried the coffin right up the steps of City Hall and into the lobby. Kenny then took over as mayor, served a term, was reelected, but then resigned shortly after a few months into his second term, and didn't hold public office thereafter, but remained the leader of the Democratic Party in Hudson County for the next basically 2 decades. Hague himself escaped any kind of indictment or any prosecution or certainly any jail, but Kenny was not as lucky. He was among those indicted in the famous Hudson 8 trial in 1970-71, where 8 officials of Hudson County were put on trial for racketeering and extortion in connection with the construction of a post office in Kearney. They apparently demanded kickbacks from the contractor. They were convicted. Kenny was sentenced to jail. He served some time in jail and then died in 1975. Just up from Kenny is the tomb, the gravesite of Mark Fagan, who was the mayor who preceded Frank Hague, a Republican, a great reformer, a very religious, honest, sober man. It's said that he climbed the steps of City Hall every day reciting a prayer to help Almighty God guide him in his judgments that day. Fagan was an undertaker, served 3 terms in office, then was defeated for 2 terms by the Democrats, and then returned to office in 1913 and served again as mayor for a 4th term, with Frank Hague as his public safety commissioner until 1917. And at that election, Hague succeeded in taking the mayoralty for himself. And he held on to that for the next 30 years, retiring in 1947.
We're now at Bayview Cemeteries, and Dennis is going to tell us a little bit about A. Harry Moore, which a high school is named after him on Kennedy Boulevard. And Dennis, why don't you tell us about the former governor?
Thank you, Mia. Arthur Harry Moore was the longest-serving governor of New Jersey in the 20th century, the only 3-term governor, and actually he served non-consecutive terms. He was he was governor from 1926 to 28, and then 32 to 35, and 38 to 1941. He was a long-time associate of Frank Hague. They were elected together on the city commission in 1913. Moore then was reelected with Hague in 1917, actually got more votes than Hague, and by tradition should have been the mayor, but they agreed, the commissioners, to make Hague the mayor, and Moore went on to other things. He was Hague's man in Trenton for his 3 terms in office. He was a great politician. He joined every organization, every society that you could imagine that would be helpful to you as a politician. The newspapers said of him that he was a creature of the Hague machine, pure and simple. He was a baby kisser and a hand kisser and loaded with charm. The New York Times said that on any subject that was of interest to the common man, Harry Moore could orate on it like a river flowing over a dam. So popularity was his specialty, and he served our state well. He was also nationally known in the early 1930s and 1932 during the Lindbergh kidnapping. He personally, as governor at that time, took charge of the investigation of the state police into the kidnapping of the infant son of the aviator Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh lived in Hopewell, New Jersey, out in the central part of the state, and Moore was governor at the time, and he made national headlines at that time. The brother of William David Edwards. The brother is Edward Irving Edwards, and Edward I. Edwards was governor of New Jersey from 1920 to 1923. After that, he was a United States Senator. Before that, he was a senator from New Jersey, where he caught the eye of Frank Hague. And when Frank Hague assumed complete power of Jersey City in 1917, he looked to enhance his position. He needed to enhance his position to solidify it by raising taxes on the principal industry in Jersey City, which was the railroads. The railroads were widely perceived to be robbing the people of Jersey City because they controlled so much property and paid only a pittance in taxes. So Hague, upon taking office as mayor, immediately raised the taxes on the railroads. The railroads fought back and went to the State Board of Tax Appeals and had the increases rolled back. Hague thought this over and decided the best thing to do would be to replace the State Board of Tax Appeals. And the way to do that would be to get a new governor who could appoint new members of the State Board of Tax Appeals. And that's where Edward I. Edwards came in. Hague ran him, backed him for governor, and he won and took office and replaced the State Board of Tax Appeals. The new board removed the restrictions, the tax increases went into effect, and the money poured into the coffers of Jersey City, solidifying Frank Hague's position. Edwards then later became a United States Senator and tried for re-election to that in 1928, but was defeated. And unfortunately, he suffered a series of personal reverses. His wife died in 1928. In the crash in 1929, he lost most of his money. He became ill, and regrettably, he took his own life in January of 1931. His name is not on this tomb for reasons that we don't know, but he is buried here in this cemetery. Here in Bayview Cemetery also is perhaps its most prominent resident. This is the tomb of Edward F.C. Young. Edward Young was considered the richest and most prominent and most powerful layman in Jersey City in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. He died in 1908, and his funeral from St. John's Episcopal Church on Summit Avenue was astounding. The streets were closed off for blocks around. Thousands of people gathered there to hear the funeral oration of Jersey City's leading citizen. He was also the power behind the political boss who preceded Frank Hague, and that was Little Bob Davis, who was tax collector at City Hall in Jersey City and ran the Democratic organization for many years. Bob Davis he died in 1911, 3 years after Young, and Hague took over the organization, which was floundering around after the death of Davis. But Young was a very interesting man. He controlled 13 or 14 major corporations in Jersey City, including the Public Service Corporation, which ran the streetcars, the Dixon Crucible Company, coal companies. And there's a very interesting story about him that he was given an honorary banquet in New York at the Salmagundi Club, and they said at the banquet, if you lived in Jersey City, you couldn't avoid Edward F.C. Young, because you would get up in the morning and you would go downstairs and have your breakfast cooked on your coal stove with the coal supplied by the Edward F.C. Young Coal Company, and then you would go to work on the Hudson Boulevard, which was created through the backing of Edward F.C. Young. You would get on the streetcar to go to work, and the streetcar was provided by the Public Service Traction Company, controlled by Mr. Young, and up above you would be a sign saying, "Please don't spit on the floor," signed by Edward Young, chairman of the Board of Health. when you went down to your office, there would be a note from your landlord, Mr. Young, about something to do with the rent. When you came home at night and read the newspaper, you could switch on the gas light or the electric light to read your paper. Either way, Mr. Young was president of the gas light or the electric light company. And when your days were at an end and they carried your coffin into Bayview Cemetery, New York Bay Cemetery right here, over the doorway on Ocean Avenue was a big stone sign that said, Edward F.C. Young, Chairman of the Cemetery Board of Trustees. So from birth to death, in Jersey City, Edward F.C. Young was right there with you all the way. In one of the more interesting elections in Jersey City history, in 1903, the son-in-law of Edward F.C. Young, who was George T. Smith. George Smith succeeded his father-in-law as president of many of the important companies in Jersey City. But in 1903, George Smith ran for mayor, and he ran against Mark Fagan, who was successful. And so it was kind of interesting because Young, having backed the political organization of Little Bob Davis, which was a Democratic organization, his son-in-law George Smith ran as a Democrat. But Smith represented the great moneyed power structure Protestant elite of Jersey City. And Mark Fagan, who ran as a Republican,